Mr. Manyalak, I'm sorry in saying this, but if you knew the law at the time and you had, if I'm not mistaken, due diligence studied by Ernst and Young, and I'm sure that you have your own legal, and you allowed such knowing that it is not compliant with the law at wala pong ibinigay ang Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas na eligibility, pag ni-reverse po natin to, in a way, there could be a conspiracy with the private sector and the DBP because from my point of view, yung pong Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas did their job in working on it because there were many studies conducted by Ernst and Young during that time and other groups making those studies. And they very well know that there are legal parameters in the selling of accounts to the private sector. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to everyone. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to first ask Mr. Manyalak. Mr. Manyalak, good morning po and thank you for obliging the committee. Maraming salamat ho. Dito po sa inyong contract on the asset sale and purchase agreement, one of the things that were part of the agreement, yung pong pinagkaisa nyo dito was the definition of certificate of eligibility. And very clearly, nakalagay po rito sa inyong agreement that there should be a BSP certificate of eligibility for all the loans that non-performing loans defined in the SPV Act. Ito po yung agreement with Lehman Brothers Development Bank of the Philippines in the DBP sealed bid public auction of non-performing assets. Is it correct to say that yung pong agreement inyo as part, on your part, that you required the Development Bank of the Philippines to ensure that an eligibility will be given to the loans that will be put in this special purpose asset vehicle? In your case, Philippine Investment Mon Lehman Brothers.
Honorable Defensor, the intent was, as with the assets that were purchased through the SPV Act, the intent was to try to get as many of the assets with the COE. It's actually much easier for the buyers if there is a COE certification from the BSP. However, we did recognize upfront that the COE process would involve help from the BSP and also with SEC. And so there was always the possibility that we would not get COEs for all of these assets. For the Lopez Group loans, particularly, my reading of the documents we have seem to indicate that around the time of signing, we were hoping to get the buy and tell in the, I think it's the Maiinit purchase with COEs. Subsequently, as we have reviewed the documents, it looks like only the buy and tell asset was able to be COE eligible. The people I've spoken to in PI have stated that for the other two loans, it may have been because these borrowers were in negotiation with their creditors at the point in time when the purchase was made, and so they could not have gotten COE eligibility. There was also a timing issue. I think you needed to have been non-performing in 2002 for you to have been COE eligible. So we did attempt from a buyer's perspective. It's much easier if we get an assets that COE eligible, but in many cases, we do not get that COE certification for the sale.
Yes, Mr. Maiinit. So is it correct that in the actual contract you have, nire-require niyo po sana ang Department of Development Bank of the Philippines to ensure that there will be a COE? Because I see now the contract and I've been reading through it. Malinaw po doon na nakalagay na dinefine ninyo a certification of the BSP that the SPV Act eligible RAPOA and NPL should be transferred subject to in accordance with the SPV Act.
Yes, sir. I think we need to make a difference between the transfers to an SPV and getting the COE. So again, the intention was to try to get the COE as much as possible. But that did not turn out to be the case. In fact, there is a provision somewhere in the contract if in fact um, the COE was never obtained as to who would bear the transfer cost. So it was already considered that we may not be successful in getting the COE. But again, the intent was, from the buyer's point of view, to get as many of these assets under a COE as possible.
Mr. Manalak, I'm sorry in saying this, but if you knew the law at the time and you had, if I'm not mistaken, due diligence studied by Ernst and Young, and I'm sure that you have your own legal, and you allowed such knowing that it is not compliant with the law at wala pong ibinigay ang Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas na eligibility, pag ni-reverse po natin to, in a way, there could be a conspiracy with the private sector and the DBP. Because from my point of view, yung pong Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas did their job in working on it. Because there were many studies conducted by Ernst and Young during that time and other groups making those studies. And they very well know that there are legal parameters in the selling of accounts to the private sector.
Sir, the obtaining the COE was basically a burden of the seller working with the BSP. So again, the contract actually contemplated the possibility that if you were to apply with the BSP and eventually you did not get a certificate, that was a possibility. Again, from our perspective, we wanted a certificate. We paid the price as if we were going to get a certificate. But in at least one instance in this in the Lopez Group loans, we thought that we were going to get a certificate. We did not, for reasons that I do not know at this point. We can research further as to why we did not get the COE. But in at least one instance, there was an expectation that we would get a COE, but we did not.
So, Mr. Manyalok, you were made to believe by DBP that those accounts, those loans, can be transferred to your SPV, Lehman, Philippine Investment One, without need of eligibility. Yung pong eligibility, for your own consumption and for your interest, but DBP, in their presentation, qualify that there may be accounts that are not eligible and can be transferred to the special purpose vehicle.
Yes, sir. As far as I understand, there are means outside of the SPV Act to transfer such credits, assignment of credits under the Civil Code. And our understanding was that if in fact an asset was not transferred with COE certification under the SPV Act, then there would be other legal measures by which we could make that transfer.
Mr. Manalak, not to, this was a long time ago, but would you know what process they mentioned aside from the SPV Act?
We do know, and even almost on a daily basis, there are purchases of credits and loans in the banking sector, in the finance sector, assignment of credit act, et cetera, et cetera. So this is fairly commonplace. The only difference, Honorable Defensor, is that under the SPV Act, you would be eligible for many benefits if you, in fact, did your transfer under the SPV Act, and especially with COE certification. So if transfers were made that did not have COE certification, then you would need to go to the Civil Code, and the benefits under the SPV Act would not apply to your transfer.
Thank you for that, Mr. Manyalak. Yung pong pag-transfer ng rights and assignments of rights, yes, it could be done easily within the private sector. But in government financial institutions, meron po kasing parameters on the book value. And I recall during this time, in fact, even earlier, Ernst and Young made a study of the National Home Mortgage and Finance Corporation. And in fact, they knew that we were constrained by certain parameters. But I'm not pointing at your company. You just made a bid and it was the responsibility of DBP to make sure that it was eligible. But I just want to know for the record, did they made you think, or they clarify that there are other parameters which you mentioned under the civil code which can be utilized? Was that the information given by DBP?
That was the information given by DBP. Also, I'm certain, I don't know the details, I'm certain by our counsel. For all of these contracts that we sign, Honorable Defensor, of course, we're very careful that we abide by the law. And I'm certain, I don't know the provision right now, I'm certain that under these contracts, there's a due authority clause where the seller assures us that they have the proper authority to transfer the assets to us.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Manyalak. In fact, yun nga po yung minimension ko kanina, dahil dito po sa inyong contract mismo, you made sure and that there was a certification of eligibility, and of course, may warranties po. Kasi alam ko naman, and I understand, that being in the private sector and you do a bid, of course, kailangan po malinaw that all legal parameters, all compliances are done. So that's correct, Mr. Manyalak, and I thank you for that. Ang pangalawa ko pong tanong, Mr. Manyalak, if you don't mind, yung pagkakabili po, first on the 9 billion, on the total amount of 9 billion, how much were you able to, the 9 billion was sold to you at 3 billion?
That's what the record shows, sir.
Okay, so that's about 30 cents to a dollar, more or less, 35.
Yes po.
At ito pong pagkakabili sa inyo, would you have in mind, in total na lang po, how much were you able to sell it back to the creditors? I mean to the owners of the accounts or the borrowers.
Honorable Defensor, if we're talking about the entire portfolio, I don't have that number with me, particularly because there are many of these accounts that are still outstanding. There are actually many accounts where we haven't paid, we haven't gotten a single centavo. So we continue to work on these accounts. If you are interested, I do have roughly the numbers for the Lopez Group loans, if you want total collections on those numbers. But on the 9 billion, I don't have that with me. I do know that a considerable number of those loans are still in the process of attempted collection, and there are quite a few where we haven't gotten any kind of payment at all since the purchase of these loans.
Yes, thank you for that, Mr. Manyalak. And most of these loans, yung po naiwan po sa inyo are mostly ROPOAs na po. May mga real estate pa kayo na nandyan and you're trying to sell more or less, Mr. Manyalak.
That is correct, Honorable Defensor.